Born and raised in Dubai, I have witnessed this city transform from a small fishing town into one of the world's most sought-after real estate investment destinations. Growing up in the 70s, my family lived near the Rafah police station, just a short walk from the Dubai Museum. Back then, my mother knew every shopkeeper by name, and a simple walk through the souks felt like being a part of this close-knit community. My father worked at the HSBC, the British Bank of the Middle East, now called the HSBC. Back in the days, he was being paid in Indian rupees and commuting in the bank's 4x4, a time when only 5 employees shared this ride. As kids, we knew exactly when he was returning home. We'd spot the small jeep making its way from the deep desert, and my mother would have his lunch ready. My schooling began at the Indian High School, which was at the time just 3 small rooms opposite the Dubai Museum. With fewer than 100 students, and of course university was in Mumbai for 3 years, but I loved Dubai so much I was here most part of my graduation as well. Having spent my entire life in Dubai, I understand the city inside out, the lifelines that keep it moving, the buzzing districts, the emerging investment hotspots, and the best neighborhoods for homeowners. Whether you're an investor or looking for a place to call home, I have the insights to help you make the right decisions. Today, I want to take you on that journey from Dubai's early days as a humble fishing and pearling town to the global investment hub that the world is watching. Hi, I'm Rakhi from Experience Realty. In the late 19th century, Linge in Persia was the dominant harbor in the Gulf region. It was the center of Gulf's pearling trade and a critical stopping point for goods entering the region. But as the century drew to a close, the Persian government faced financial pressures. To raise revenue, they imposed increasingly high taxes on Linge. By 1900s, these taxes had become so burdensome that the city's business community began looking for alternatives on the Arabian coast of the Gulf. At first, their attention turned to Sharjah and Ras Al Khaimah. Both offered established ports and a larger trading community. But then, Dubai entered the picture. The ruler of Dubai at the time, Sheikh Maktoum, saw an opportunity and he acted decisively. In 1894, he declared Dubai a free trade port, abolishing all import and export taxes. That alone would have been enough to turn heads, but Sheikh Maktoum went further. He offered land to the merchants of Linge at no cost. He guaranteed their safety and provided additional benefits to encourage them to relocate their businesses to Dubai. There was one condition though, and it was significant. Sheikh Maktoum insisted that anyone who called Dubai home or used it as a trading hub had to practice tolerance. Tribal, ethnic, or religious divisions would not influence a merchant's standing in the community. In a sense, Sheikh Maktoum created a space where commerce could thrive free from social or political interference. This land was primarily in Bastakia, Al-Fahidi as we call now. The Persians built the Bastakia neighborhood named for the ancestral town of Bastak in south-central Iran. These bold moves didn't attract Persian merchants. They set the stage for what Dubai would later become. The principles Sheikh Maktoum established, free trade, safety for businesses, and inclusivity, became the bedrock of Dubai's economic success. This wasn't just a response to the crisis in Linge. It was a visionary strategy. Sheikh Maktoum understood that the future of Dubai lay in creating an environment where trade and enterprise could flourish. And the foundation he built continues to define Dubai today. By 1908, the population reached 10,000 people. Let's fast forward to 1929, a very different Dubai. At the time, it was a modest fishing village with a population of around 30,000 people. Life was simple, the city was under the calm leadership of Sheikh Saeed Al Maktoum. He was the ruler known for his peaceful and steady demeanor, not exactly the ambitious drive that would later define his son Sheikh Rashid and grandson Sheikh Muhammad. We could say that Sheikh Saeed was Neville Chamberlain to Sheikh Rashid and Sheikh Muhammad's Winston Churchill. Back then, pearl wealthy shaped Dubai's economy and identity. Prosperity gave rise to a more refined lifestyle, with wealthy merchants upgrading from palm stick homes to clay and coral stone mansions. But it wasn't just about luxury. Persian and Indian traders bought new ideas, cultures, and architectural structures, transforming areas like Bastakia and Shindiga with wind towers estate that stood as symbols of status and inspiration. But the pearling industry, while lucrative, was far from stable. It was an industry vulnerable to forces beyond the merchants' control, and its decline was inevitable. Neither the merchants nor Sheikh Saeed could have foreseen just how fleeting this prosperity could be. They had no way of knowing Dubai's true transformation lay decades ahead, driven not by pearls, but by oil, trade, and real estate. For now, though the Dubai of 1929 was all about tradition, the leaders, the people, they had no idea what kind of earth-shaking changes were coming. But hey, hindsight, 2020, right? All right, let me give you a little background on why Dubai is such a sought-after real estate market, let alone the economy. Located in the southeastern coast of the Persian Gulf, in what is now the northeast of the United Arab Emirates, Dubai sits in a spot that's as strategic as it gets. The Persian Gulf is an unusually shallow sea, never more than 300 feet deep, with some of the hottest and the saltiest waters on earth. Before air conditioning, Dubai residents use this extreme salinity to their advantage, floating effortlessly in the Gulf to cool off, and even taking naps on its surface. Now, before the UAE became a united nation, this area was known as the Trucial Coast. Now, we won't get all the details of those maritime treaties with all Britain, but the gist of it. They were meant to put an end to piracy in the Persian Gulf. And that's important because piracy wasn't just a headline issue back then. It directly impacted the livelihoods of the people living and working along the coast. What really makes Dubai stand out? Its geographical positioning. This isn't just any spot on the map, it's a global crossroad. Dubai's location ties to all the Gulf states, East Africa and South Asia. And here's why it gets even more interesting. It's less than an 8-hour flight to 65% of the world GDP and half the population of the world. Think about that. In less than half a day's travel, Dubai can connect to the majority of the global economy. And there's the airport. Dubai International Airport isn't just busy. It's a giant in global travel. It's the busiest airport in the world for international passengers. It's second in the world when you include all the passenger traffic. And when it comes to cargo, back in 2019, it ranked as the 7th busiest cargo airport in the world. So why does this matter? Well, it shows us that Dubai's success isn't just about oil or skyscrapers. It's about the geographical strategy and the ability to connect the dots. That's the foundation Dubai is built on. In 1929, as I stated earlier, was the year when Dubai's pearling industry collapsed. It wasn't just a bad year, it was a total devastation. Merchants who had been the backbone of Dubai's economy and the primary funders of the state treasury were suddenly bankrupt. These were the people who had real power in the emirate, and when the pearl prices crashed, so did their influence. But here's a twist. While the merchants were struggling, Sheikh Saeed, Dubai's ruler at the time, didn't just survive, he thrived. While others faced ruin, Sheikh Zayed emerged stronger, and in that shift, fortunes didn't sit well with the merchants. Frustrated by the diminished power, they began pushing for economic reforms, trying to regain their standing. Things, however, only got worse for them. By 1933, pearl prices dropped another 20%. Meanwhile, Sheikh Zayed was finding new ways to build wealth. In 1934, the British arrived, established an airbase in Dubai, and started paying royalties for oil exploration. This was the game changer. For the first time in Dubai's history, the ruler no longer relied on the merchants for financial support, and Sheikh Zayed became financially independent. Let's jump to 1939. This was the point when Dubai was on the brink of a massive transformation. Between 1939 and 1990, the city began to evolve in ways that reshaped not just Dubai, but the entire Gulf. The old system, where rulers relied on merchants for funding, had crumbled, and a completely new power structure emerged. Then came the 1940s, and let me tell you, the 1940s were brutal. World War II hit roots harder and revenues collapsed. With life getting harder in the West, the first thing they stopped buying were luxuries like pearl. All across the Gulf, including Dubai, people were actually facing starvation. It got so bad that the British had to step in and distribute food rations to the areas they controlled. But here where it gets interesting. The merchants, those same merchants who had lost so much power, proved just how resourceful they could be. They took the food rations, kept what they needed, and sold the rest on the markets in the neighboring countries. Think about that for a second. Even in the middle of crisis, they were finding ways to adapt, to hustle, and to make money. It's a simple glimpse of the entrepreneurial spirit that has defined Dubai ever since. This period, from the collapse of the pearling industry to the chaos of the 1940s, wasn't just about survival. It was about setting new stage for Dubai we know today. The merchants' influence may have diminished, but their adaptability laid the groundwork for the city's future as a trading hub. And Sheikh Zayed's financial independence, that was the beginning of a new era, one where the ruler's vision would shape Dubai's destiny. Stay with me because this is just the start of a much bigger story. Okay, let's start with Sheikh Rashid officially taking over his father's duty as a ruler of Dubai in 1958. Back then, Dubai was exactly thriving compared to its neighbors. Countries like Egypt, Iran, Dubai was miles behind. Those nations had oil, wealth, modern infrastructure, and were already progressing into the 20th century. Dubai, on the other hand, was literally dark. At night, planes and ships passing by couldn't even see it. Sheikh Rashid inherited this enormous challenge, and one of the first issues he tackled was Dubai Creek. The creek was vital. It was Dubai's connection to global trade, but it was clogged with silt, limiting its use only to small boats. Fixing it wasn't important, it was necessary. The problem? It wasn't going to be cheap, and Dubai did not have the money for major dredging projects. So what did Sheikh Rashid do? He got creative. He raised funds from sources he could: taxes, bonds, merchant donations, and even loan from Kuwait. By 1961, the creek was completely transformed. Suddenly, ships that could carry 3 times the cargo of a decade earlier were docking in Dubai. But Sheikh Rashid wasn't just focused on paying off debts. He was thinking long-term. He used these loans strategically, repaying them quickly while enriching key merchant families like the Ghurairs and the Futems by granting them exclusive business licenses. These families became central to Dubai's economic success and played a vital role in supporting Sheikh Rashid's vision. Now, it's important to note that this period wasn't just about surviving tough times. The famine and the chaos of war pushed Sheikh Rashid to think bigger, to focus on building a better future. Fast forward to 1959. John R. Harris, a British architect, was introduced to Sheikh Rashid by a British political agent. Harris quickly gained Sheikh Rashid's trust and became his go-to advisor for Dubai's new master plan. He had a way of matching Sheikh Rashid's vision with the architect that both embraced modernity and maintained a sustainable approach. While Dubai was transforming from an open desert to a modern city, Harris's work remained largely ignored by the British and the European architects. His influence shaped the city, but it happened quietly, just like Dubai's early rise, steady, deliberately, and largely unnoticed. By the early 1960s, the difference was unmistakable. Dubai now had modern port, electricity, running water, telephones, and even street lights. A city that had once been invisible at night was suddenly lit up, literally and metaphorically. Okay, so let's go back to the 1950s. This was a pivotal time for Dubai. 130 years after the British first showed up in the Gulf, Western medicine finally arrived in the city. It started with the opening of Al Maktoum Hospital. Now, this wasn't just some grand medical facility. It was just a small clinic surrounded by sand dunes and scrub. But for a city grappling with big challenges, it was a step forward. Education was a whole other challenge. Dubai was considered the most developed town east of Bahrain, yet formal schooling was nearly absent. Most of the schools that had flourished during the Pearl boom had closed by 1930s, leaving only a handful of institutions that offered minimal instruction in subjects like math and history. Literacy rates were low and writing skills were rare. For those seeking a more comprehensive education, the only option was to travel abroad to Iran, India, or Pakistan. Even then, education was often met with skepticism, resulting in one of the widest education gaps in the world. At the same time, the city was marked by a stark contrast. On one side, you had signs of prosperity from trade. On the other, people were living in primitive conditions, mud brick houses, no real infrastructure. This wealth disparity was glaring. The dredging of the creek had given Dubai the long-needed prosperity. Sheikh Rashid used the revenues from the creek to start building Port Rashid, the biggest project in the history of Dubai at that time. Now be patient, we'll go into discussion of this port in a bit. First, let's talk about the souks. The souks became the lifeblood of Dubai's economy during this resurgence. You had the gold souk, the spice souk, the textile souk, all buzzing with merchants from India, Persia, and Africa. The gold souk in particular played a massive role. It earned Dubai the nickname City of Gold, drawing buyers from across the world. By 1968, Dubai was importing £56 million worth of gold. Most of it wasn't staying in Dubai though. It was being re-exported to the international waters off the coast of India. This trade boom built the foundation of city's infrastructure. It also drew attention from global corporations like British Petroleum and Shell. This was the start to Dubai's transformation into a global player in commerce. Dubai in 1950, the area in this photo shows Bur Dubai in the foreground, Deira in the middle right, on the other side of the creek, and Shindiga and Al Ras in the background across the creek from Deira. In 1962, the Qatari Amir invested 162 million pounds to fund this Maktoum Bridge. This project wasn't just about building a bridge, it resolved a major logistical issue. For the first time, residents could cross between Bur-Dubai and Deira directly, cutting out the long, exhausting detour around the creek. This improved connectivity between the two key areas, Bur-Dubai, a residential and a cultural hub, and Deira, the center of trade and commerce. With easier movement, trade and daily life became more efficient, especially for merchants and businesses. By the late 1960s and the early 1970s, Dubai embarked on a period of structured suburban expansion. The Shindiga Tunnel, I was a witness to this opening. I remember my grandmother telling me not to go for the opening, just in case the water overflows into the tunnel, as it was constructed beneath the creek and two major bridges, the Maktoum and the Garud. These projects weren't just about convenience, they were deliberate steps to keep up with the city's growing population and trade activities. During this time, Deira established itself as the economic nerve center of Dubai, handling coastal shipping, re-exports, and housing the international airport. Meanwhile, the areas around the creek developed rapidly with the creation of an international harbor, dry dock, and industrial zones that supported the city's economic activity. Residential areas expanded outward, with Jumeirah becoming a prominent neighborhood and development stretching towards Jebel Ali. This shift wasn't random. It was a response to the demands of a growing population and the need for residential, industrial, and logistic spaces to coexist. Let's talk about oil in Dubai, because this was the moment that changed everything. In 1966, oil was discovered 20 kilometers off the coast in Al Fateh offshore concession. For a city that had survived on trade and pearls for decades, this was a turning point. But here's the thing. Sheikh Rashid knew Dubai's oil reserves were limited, especially compared to Abu Dhabi, which had 95% of UAE's oil wealth. He didn't see oil as the foundation of Dubai's future. He saw it as a tool to build that future. And he acted fast. One of the first places Sheikh Rashid invested this oil wealth was in the skies. By 1968, Dubai's airport was capable of handling Boeing 747s, the largest aircraft in the world at that time. However, this airport still had a very small mark on the world at that time. Unlike today, building an airport wasn't enough. Sheikh Rashid knew that for Dubai to grow, its ports needed to be just as competitive as the skies. So in 1967, he commissioned the construction of Port Rashid. It wasn't cheap, but by 1971, the first berth was operational. And when Queen Elizabeth II herself inaugurated the port in 1972, which is an interesting story, she was originally meant to stop over in Bahrain for a fuel refill. But when she heard that Sheikh Rashid was opening a port in Dubai, she wanted to come and see it. Just as Port Rashid was beginning to transform Dubai's economy, something else happened that took things to the next level. The 1973 oil embargo sent global prices soaring by 400%. For oil importing countries, it was a crisis. But for oil exporting regions like Dubai, it was a financial windfall. Sheikh Rashid used this sudden surge in revenue to fund even more ambitious projects. Take Jebel Ali Port, for instance. By 1979, it became the largest man-made harbour in the world. And Sheikh Rashid didn't stop there. He introduced the Jebel Ali Free Zone in 1985, offering tax-free operations for international businesses. Between 1968 and 1978, the average population growth in Dubai was about 13%, and by 1978, the population reached 218,000 people. But here's what set Sheikh Rashid apart. He wasn't content to rely on oil and trade alone. He had a bigger vision for Dubai's economy. Projects like Dubai Aluminium and the Dubai World Trade Center, the tallest building in the Middle East at that time, showed his commitment to diversification. By 1980, Dubai had become a regional hub for finance, trade, shipping, supported by influx of workers from India, Pakistan, and the Philippines, who played a crucial role in building the industries that still define Dubai today. So what's the lesson here? Sheikh Rashid didn't just take advantage of oil wealth. He used it strategically, reinvesting in ways that set Dubai apart from its neighbors. All right, 1971. While NASA was busy sending people to the moon for the fourth time and Israel was locking down territory, the British Empire was falling apart. And one of the things it left behind, the Trucial States, 7 tiny sheikdoms with no central government, no unified currency, no private property laws, and barely any roads. No one thought they'd make it. And while that was happening, 6 of the 7 sheikdoms met in Dubai on 2nd December 1971 to do something no one expected: form the United Arab Emirates. I remember my father telling me stories of how big this matter was and how Dubai celebrated by giving flags out to everyone on the streets. My older sister was tiny and I was tinier. They gave her one too, while she didn't understand anything. Imagine the excitement of the country. The place was barely connected. Even the road between Abu Dhabi and Dubai, the 2 powerhouses, was just getting built. It wouldn't be finished until 1980, but that was just the beginning. A slow, deliberate move toward unification and modernization. Dubai's land ownership started as a mix of tribal customs and family, designed to serve Emiratis and Gulf nationals. Before formal property laws, land was distributed based on traditional locals who built on their own land, while undeveloped land belonged to the ruling family. If the government needed land for public projects, owners were compensated. By 1960, land ownership was split. Developed plots could be traded freely, but newly reclaimed land stayed under the ruler's control. Emiratis often received land grants, removing the need to buy property, while foreigners were mostly limited to leases. Over long-term leases became common in trade hubs like Deira, Fahidi, where the commerce around the creek was booming. This system preserved tribal traditions while adapting to urban growth, shaping the property laws that followed. Dubai's economic transformation has been state-led, with the government steering major infrastructure and development initiatives, while the private sector played a supporting role. In the 1940s and 50s, Dubai's merchant class was integrated into a hybrid governance system, participating in economic growth but with a limited political influence. Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum reinforced this in his Dubai Strategic Plan 2007-15 speech, emphasizing that government leadership was the primary driver of this progress. Key projects like Internet City, Media City, alongside legislative reforms and modernization efforts, cemented Dubai's appeal to investors, empowering the private sector while keeping strategic locations within cities' limits. Dubai didn't start out as a city of highways. It was built for walking, tight souks, narrow alleys, everything close together. Cars weren't a part of the picture. But as the city grew, it embraced modernity, and that meant making space for these cars. It made sense. When it's hot, no one wants to walk. Air-conditioned cars became the obvious choice. Roads got wider, buildings spread out, and walking or cycling stopped being a part of this daily life. The Dubai that was known to be a walking city in the 70s was no more. With that came massive infrastructure expansion. Dubai's airport wasn't always a global hub. Back in the mid-80s, it was handling traffic, but nowhere near the scale it does today. So between 1985 and 1987, Dubai expanded Terminal 1, upgraded infrastructure, and built a third runway. The expansion worked terminal capacity shot up from 1.5 million to 6 million passengers a year. Cargo handling went from 50,000 tons in 1980 to over 300,000 tons by 1987. It transformed the real estate market around the airport. Hotels, office spaces, logistics hubs popped up, especially in the Garud and Dera area, where demand surged for commerce and industrial properties. And today, it is one of the busiest, most vibrant areas in the city. People aren't just passing through, they live and work here. You see them walking on the streets, sitting in cafes, running businesses. The lack of highways in the area keeps it moving at a human scale. It's one of the few parts of Dubai that still feels like a walking city. And if you want a change of pace, downtown is just 15 minutes away. When the World Trade Center was completed in 1980, it was the tallest in the Middle East. That might not sound like much now, but back then it was a big deal. I was talking to my dad about it. He's been in Dubai for over 60 years, seen it all. When I told him this tower, he reminded me when we went to Abu Dhabi, and on our way back, seeing the Trade Center felt like we finally arrived to Dubai. Because in 1980, Dubai wasn't the city you see today. Jumeirah felt far. Dera and Bur Dubai were the only real urban centers. And yet, right there in the middle of the desert, they went and built the tallest tower in the Middle East. That kind of ambition. That set the tone for everything that came next. The route connecting Dubai to Abu Dhabi was just a desert road with no barriers between the traffic to and from Abu Dhabi, and just a one-way road. But as oil wells started flowing in, so did the need for proper infrastructure. By the mid-70s, Sheikh Rashid planned a major expansion, naming the road after Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan, the leader of Abu Dhabi and president of UAE at the time. The construction of what would become Dubai's most important highways started in the late 70s, and by the early 80s, Sheikh Zayed Road was a fully operational 6-lane highway. It was a necessary upgrade, connecting key districts and setting the foundation for future commercial and residential growth. By the 90s, Sheikh Zayed Road skyline began taking shape, with Emirates Towers and the others rising along its path. The road's accessibility fueled demand for office spaces, luxury hotels, and high-rise apartments, turning it into a center of Dubai's economic activity. Traffic surged, leading to massive expansion, and by 2000, the introduction of Dubai Red Line Metro, running parallel to ease congestion. What started as a road through the desert had become a corridor of business, finance, and real estate, defining modern Dubai. In 1999, Dubai had a simple idea: create a space for tech companies. Nothing too flashy, just a dedicated business zone. They called it Dubai Internet City. Nobody knew if it would work. Launched in 2000, the investment was modest. On the day of the launch, Internet City had 85 companies, full capacity, and a long waiting list. But Dubai had already made a habit of turning big ideas into reality, and this was no different. The example in discussion is Jafza. The plan? Build an ecosystem where global tech firms could set up shop, work tax-free, and connect with a region hungry for digital transformation. It started small, but the idea caught on fast. Soon, it wasn't just about tech. Dubai expanded into media, education, and more. Today, that little business zone holds 4,500 companies and employs 55,000 people. All right, let's talk about Burj Al Arab. You know that sail-shaped hotel off Dubai's coast? The one that screams luxury and is basically a giant billboard saying Dubai has arrived. Back in the early 90s, Dubai was ambitious. Sheikh Mohammed wanted something that would make a statement. Not just another hotel, but a landmark. Something that when you saw it, you'd immediately think of Dubai. When you heard the word Burj, you should think about Burj Al Arab. So in 1993, architect Tom Wright sketched out a design, a sail, simple, modern, and crucially distinct shape. When Sheikh Mohammed saw it, his response was clear: build it. Construction kicked off in 1994, but they weren't just pulling up a hotel. They built an island for the first, 700 feet off the coast.
The construction team built the island the hotel sits on with steep rock slopes, then covered them with concrete armor to absorb the force of the waves.
That alone was an engineering headache. Workers dumped tons of rocks into the sea to create a foundation. No shortcuts, no budget concerns. By 1999, Burj Al Arab was standing glowing at night like a futuristic lighthouse, and it worked. It became one of the most photographed buildings on the planet. Every major project from Sheikh Zayed Road to Burj Al Arab was about keeping up with the demand for Dubai and to build a brand image. The airport expansion turned Al Garood and way later Dubai Creek Harbour into real estate hotspots. Dubai Internet City needs space for global tech firms, and the metro gave new life to communities along its routes. Infrastructure matters, but it's only one part of this story. People drive Dubai's real estate market just as much as the projects do. Families see it as a once-in-a-lifetime place to settle, a city offering safety, opportunity, and a lifestyle few places can match. Young professionals are drawn to its skylines, career opportunities, and global community. Investors don't just see properties, they see a city that keeps growing, keeps adapting, and keeps providing itself as a place where people want to live, work, and build their future. All right, let's talk about Dubai's real estate boom and bust between 2002 and 2008. In the early 2000s, Dubai was on fire. Just between 2002 and 2004, Palm Jumeirah, Palm Jebel Ali, Palm Deira, and the World Islands were either launched or announced. Towers were going up fast. Prices in areas like downtown and Marina jumped 5x in 5 years. But by 2008, cracks started to show. Prices had soared too high, too fast. Then the global financial crisis hit, and Dubai, which had overbuilt in anticipation of endless demand, was suddenly facing a harsh reality. And here's the thing, crises like these, they are complicated. Sometimes you get a banking crisis without real estate collapsing, or a real estate crash without affecting the banks. But when both hit at the same time, that's when things get messy. 7 to 10 years messy. And if a currency crisis gets thrown in, disaster. So how did Dubai escape this total collapse? Because the UAE's monetary authorities stepped in at the right time. Unlike other markets that saw real estate and banking failures feed into each other, Dubai kept its financial system intact, preventing a much deeper crash. Between 2002 and 2008, Dubai's GDP grew at an annual rate of 12.2%, with the non-oil sector expanding from 46 to 95% of the economy. The real estate sector alone contributed 79 billion in 2008, up from 10 billion in 2000, reflecting an 8-fold increase. Foreign direct investment inflows into Dubai reached 142.2 billion in 2007, a 50% increase from 2005. Property prices in some areas such as Dubai Marina rose over 300% between 2003 and 8, with apartments that were selling at 500 per square feet in 2003 reaching 2,000 per square feet mid-2008. The surge in construction led to a 5-fold increase in land transaction values, jumping from 29 billion in 2004 to 152 billion in 2008. Dubai's real estate expansion coincided with a global credit boom that saw global liquidity reach $150 trillion in 2007, up from $36 trillion in 2000. International banks, financial institutes increased lending by 75% between 2004 and 7, with mortgage lending in the UAE reaching 64 billion dirhams in 2008, up from 8.4 billion in 2004. On September 18, 2004, DIFC was open for business and quickly became a lending financial center, attracting banks, investment firms, and asset managers. Major banks, which had set up operations in DIFC, were lending aggressively. The financial bubble caused many DIFC-registered firms and government-related entities to roll over debts. There weren't just one or two bubbles, there were 4 big ones: the tech bubble, the housing bubble, finance bubble, the commodity bubble. By 2008, real estate and construction accounted for 41% of Dubai's total employment, with over 500,000 construction workers employed on projects worth over $430 billion. At its peak, Dubai housed 24% of the world's construction cranes. In May 2002, Dubai enacted freehold property ownership for foreigners. Within 2 years, property transaction volume surged from 4 billion dirhams to 30 billion dirhams in 2004. Nakhil's Palm Jumeirah, which launched in 2002, sold all the 4,000 beachfront villas within 72 hours, generating over $10 billion in sales. Burj Khalifa development saw over 90% of its units sold even before completion, with prices rising from 2,000 dirhams per square feet in 2005 to 4,500 in 2008. By 2008, foreign buyers accounted for 82% of Dubai's real estate transactions, contributing over 100 billion dirhams to the property sector. Between 2002 and mid-2008, oil prices rose from $25 per barrel to $147 per barrel, generating an estimated 1.3 trillion additional revenues in the Gulf economies. Dubai, with a 7% share of UAE's oil production, saw its government budget increase from 8.3 billion dirhams in 2002 to 29 billion dirhams in 2008, largely due to increased economic activity. Now here's the twist. Unlike the oil booms of the 70s and the 90s, Gulf countries didn't just stash their money in London or New York this time. They reinvested it back home, with Dubai leading the charge as the Gulf's first post-oil economy. Oil wealth funded massive infrastructure projects, and while speculation blurred the lines between the growth and the risk, this reinvestment helped cushion Dubai when the inevitable real estate crash hit. Oil wealth supported infrastructure, mega projects, including the $6.6 billion expansion of the Dubai International Airport and the $4 billion Dubai Metro and the $20 billion Dubai Land Project. However, over-leveraging in real estate projects, combined with a sudden decline in oil prices to $34 per barrel by December 2008, placed financial pressure on this market. The UAE dirham has been pegged to the US dollar at 3.6725 dirhams per USD since 1997. By 2008, inflation in UAE reached 12.3%, with Dubai's rental inflation exceeding 22% year on year. In 2007, foreign banks deposited 211 billion dirhams in UAE's banking system, expecting a possible evaluation of the dirham. This inflow of speculative capital increased credit availability, driving up real estate prices. By December 2009, these deposits had declined to 75 billion dirhams, marking an exit of 136 billion dirhams in 1 year. The sudden reversal contributed to tighter liquidity and a sharp correction in the real estate prices, with some properties losing up to 60% of their value between 2008 and 2010. Between 2000 and 2008, Dubai's population grew from 862,000 to 1.8 million, an increase of 108% in 8 years. In 2009, the city had the highest net migration rate in the world, with over 7.5% annual population growth. Dubai's workforce was heavily skewed toward real estate and construction, with 80% of its labor force consisting of expats. The demographic structure showed a high concentration of males aged 20 to 45, who accounted for 83% of this workforce. Despite the 2008 financial crisis, Dubai's population continued to increase, reaching 1.92 million by 2010. Unlike markets that saw population decline during downturns, Dubai's high level of economic migration softened the real estate market's impact. Even as property values declined, many of Dubai's largest real estate developments were driven by government-related entities, which had access to the substantial capital but also took a significant financial risk. Dubai World, which owned Nakheel and Isthimar, accumulated $59 billion in liabilities by 2009. When property sales slowed and refinancing became difficult, the company restructured $23.5 billion in debt, which essentially means that the company found more ways to make the debt more manageable by extending the repayment period, converting debt into equity by paying back using shares instead of cash, or in some extreme cases, debt write-offs, where creditors may agree to forgive part of that debt. Lenders got way too comfortable handling loan to government-related entities, assuming the Dubai government would always have their back. That confidence led to some very relaxed risk assessments. But when the 2009 debt crisis hit, reality kicked in. Dubai had to step in with $10 billion emergency bailout, and Abu Dhabi followed with another $10 billion emergency bailout, keeping the whole system from unraveling. Without that support, defaults would have spread fast, triggering an even bigger mess. So what were the key takeaways? First, Dubai's 2002 to 2008 real estate journey is a textbook example of an ambition meeting reality. It revealed the dangers of over-reliance on speculative inflows, unchecked risk-taking, and the moral hazards tied to hybrid corporations. When money is flowing, everyone's a genius. But when the tide turns, the cracked bones become painfully clear. Second, even in the face of a massive global financial crisis and its own real estate crash, Dubai didn't crumble. Population growth, government intervention and a willingness to adapt kept things moving forward. Dubai learned that ambition is critical, but balancing it with a caution and fiscal responsibility what ensures long-term success. The lesson here, bold moves can build a city, but sustainable growth comes from knowing when to pump the cracks. After the 2008 financial crisis, Dubai had to rethink how it was handled real estate. The freewheeling, debt-fueled boom was over, and in its place came tighter regulations and a push for sustainability. Stricter lending rules, better oversight, and a focus on long-term stability replaced the wild speculation of the pre-crisis years. The result? A market that didn't just recover, it evolved, aligning itself with global financial standards and setting stage for more sustainable growth. The financial crisis catalyzed a shift towards sustainable real estate development in Dubai, as the city embraced environmentally conscious practices to future-proof its infrastructure. The Green Buildings Regulations was initiated in 2010. These regulations focused on improving energy and water efficiency in new developments. A total of 79 phased-in rules emphasize energy, water conservation, alternative energy sources, and waste management. Tools like Building Information Modeling (BIM) were introduced to ensure compliance during the design phases. The Executive Council Resolution number 46 of 2014. In 2014, the term sustainability was no longer just a buzzword. If developers wanted a construction permit, they had to prove they weren't cutting corners on environmental standards. Green building certificates became mandatory, forcing projects to meet stricter efficiency benchmarks. By aligning itself with global sustainability benchmarks, Dubai attracted eco-conscious investors and residents, reinforcing its reputation as a forward-thinking city. They introduced the Uqood platform in 2008, making it mandatory to pre-register off-plan sales. This gave buyers confidence their purchases were secure. The Law number 13 of 2008 also came into play, tightening the regulations of sales purchase agreements, though it took some time to iron out the details in the code. In 2009, Dubai felt the weight of global financial crisis. The real estate prices dropped significantly. The market hit historical lows. Apartment prices averaged at 800 per square feet, villas dropped to 857, and townhouses were around 813 dirhams per square feet. Looking at this today, you're probably thinking, damn, you're right, 800 dirhams per square feet is half of what property prices are averaging at today. But I said 20 minutes ago, hindsight 2020, right? Moving on, the declines range between 44 and 48%. To stabilize things, the central bank stepped up early. By March 2008, they introduced liquidity facilities to keep cash flowing. Then in October, they guaranteed all deposits and interbank lending for 3 years. On top of that, they launched a 19.1 billion liquidity support fund, ensuring banks had the resource to weather the storm. Amid this uncertainty, the government focused on infrastructure. The Dubai Metro opened its Red Line in 2009, Green Line in 2010, providing affordable transport and boosting the value of property near stations by 15 to 25%. Tourism landmarks like Burj Khalifa, Dubai Marina drew international attention, with apartments in the Burj climbing up and selling at 2,300 to 2,800 per square feet. These developments helped shift the market today recovered. Okay, so after 2011, Dubai needed to get investors back in. What did they do? They rolled out long-term visas. set up free zone with tax breaks, and let foreign investor own 100% of businesses in certain areas. And guess what? It worked. Foreign direct investments shot up from 16.8 billion to 33.7 billion by 2011. Dubai became a magnet for businesses and high net worth looking to park their money. But recovery didn't come without problems. Residential demand surged. Prices went up. Some areas got overcrowded. The government had to step in, joint ownership laws, affordable housing projects, just to keep the market from overheating. By 2014, Dubai had figured out the game. It wasn't just about bouncing back. It was about staying ahead. Regulations got tighter. Development became more measured. The real estate market wasn't running wild anymore. It was adapting, becoming more sustainable. Because if Dubai has learned anything from its past booms and busts, it's that growth for the sake of growth doesn't always end well. The Arab Spring, which was between 2010-12, was a series of pre-democracy uprisings that swept across the Middle East and North Africa, leading to the fall of regimes like in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, were triggering civil wars in Syria and economic instability in many countries. While the movement aimed to bring democratic reforms, it often resulted in political chaos, economic downturn, and social unrest. The Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, largely avoided the protests due to strong government responses and financial stability. However, the unrest disrupted regional trade, slowed foreign investments, and led to declining tourism in affected countries. Oil prices fluctuated due to instability in key producers like Libya, and global supply chains faced uncertainty. Many businesses sought safer environments for operations, shifting investments to stable Gulf nations. As turmoil spread, Dubai emerged as a safe haven for businesses and families seeking stability. Its stronger governance, tax-free policies, and high-end infrastructure made it an attractive destination for expatriates fleeing unrest. Investors, entrepreneurs, and professionals moved their families to Dubai, driving higher demand for real estate. This influx of wealth and migration pushed property prices and rental rates upwards, transforming Dubai into one of the most desirable global cities for living and investment. After the financial crisis, Dubai wasn't about to let history repeat itself. The government and the regulators tightened the screws on reckless lending and speculation. Banks had to hold more capital, basically keeping a bigger safety net in case things went south. Liquidity rules got tougher too, forcing banks to balance their books better so they wouldn't run dry when things got shaky. Then came the biggest hit to the property speculation, LTV, loan to value limits. Before the crisis, buyers could get away with about anything, 95% LTV, and in some cases, the developers even handing out 100% financing on off-plan properties like it was candy. This meant a lot of people were borrowing money they had no way of paying back. That changed fast. Expats saw their LTV caps slashed to 50-75%. It didn't stop there. The Dubai Financial Services Authority introduced mandatory annual stress tests, making sure financial firms weren't just surviving in good times, but could handle another downturn. Financial transparency became non-negotiable. All DIFC registered companies had to disclose more, stress test their finances, and prove they weren't hiding any skeletons in the books. One of the biggest wake-up calls was Dubai World's 26 billion debt restructuring in 2009-10, a painful but necessary overhaul that forced better oversight of government-related entities and how they manage their finances. Then in 2016, Dubai introduced a bankruptcy law, giving struggling businesses a structured way to deal with debt instead of collapsing overnight. It wasn't just about fixing the cracks in the system. It was about making sure Dubai could take a hit and keep going. Between 2011 and 14, Dubai's real estate market was in full recovery mode. After the 2008 financial crisis left the city with unfinished projects and plummeting property values, the government doubled down on infrastructure, foreign investments, and economic diversification. By 2012, total real estate transactions reached 154 billion, making an 8% year-on-year increase, with property prices surging 20 to 30%. Luxury areas like downtown Dubai and Palm Jumeirah saw the highest gains, while affordable communities like Jumeirah Village Circle, Discovery Gardens also benefited from improved connectivity and rental demand. High oil prices, around $100 per barrel, ensured liquidity in the market, attracting investors from India, China, and Russia. Regulatory reforms, including stricter off-plan sales laws and escrow regulations, reassured international buyers that Dubai had moved past the speculative chaos of the pre-2008 boom. A major catalyst was the 2013 Expo 2020 announcement, which sparked speculative buying and major project launches. Dubai South, a massive mixed-use district near Al Maktoum Airport, was positioned as Expo's centerpiece, fueling land appreciation in that area. Blue Water Island, a 6 billion development featuring Ain Dubai, promising to boost Dubai's global tourism appeal. Today, Blue Water Island is trending at 4,000 dirhams per square feet. Transport upgrades, including metro, road improvements, lifted property values in key districts. Meanwhile, new luxury hotels including Four Seasons Resort, Grand Sheraton exceeded 10 million visitors annually. But not everything was smooth sailing. Rising property values were met with concerns over affordability, and by 2014, residential prices grew by 15%. The market was recovering, but this time with more structure, better regulations, and a long-term vision shaped by Expo 2020. However, due to oversupply in the market from new and excited developers, property prices began dropping. Additionally, there was a spillover of oversupply from 2008 as developers had started building by 2011 once again. By 2015, oil prices were low. The US dollar was strong and global investors were getting cautious. Since the UAE dirham is pegged to the dollar, property in Dubai became expensive for buyers using weaker currencies like the euro, British pound, and Russian ruble. At the same time, wealthy Western and Gulf investors saw an opportunity. While real estate prices in London and New York became less attractive, Dubai's 7.1% net yields still made it a competitive market, plus an investment in the US dollar. Investors' confidence started to cool, though residential prices had been slipping since the 2014 peak, and by 2019 they had dropped 25 to 33%. But this also meant bargains. Bulk buyers saw an opening and interest from Asian investors, particularly Chinese and Indian buyers. They surged. Oil prices dropped from $100 to $30, which prompted Gulf buyers to pour less money into Dubai's real estate market. This city's real estate market is treated as a hedge from inflation because unlike, let's say, Mumbai, the prices of real estate in this city keeps up with the inflation, whereas Mumbai, prices of property dropped even though inflation was up. Oversupply was a growing issue. In 2018 alone, 23,000 residential units were delivered and 31,000 more were expected in 2019. The biggest change was who was buying. Population growth was leaning towards lower income groups, shifting demand towards affordable housing. Areas like Jumeirah Village Circle, Dubai Sports City became hotspots, while mid to end properties faced slower demand. The government stepped in with new policies. 10-year investor visa with a 10 million investment, and the central bank's decision to remove the 20% cap on real estate lending gave the market a boost. Dubai's office market was still feeling the impact of the 2009 crisis, but vacancy rates were improving. Prime office spaces attracted institutional investors with yields remaining competitive. But the big story was in hospitality. Dubai was gearing up for Expo 2020 and tourism infrastructure was in full expansion mode. Between 2015 and 19, 24,600 new hotel rooms entered the market. Occupancy rates were strong, averaging 75 to 80%, but oversupply kept profit margins tight. The shift was clear. The focus was moving towards mid-market hotels, catering to budget-conscious travelers. The government encouraged this shift with the incentives, ensuring that tourism growth wasn't just about luxury. Retail was immune to change. Online shopping was rising, forcing major developers like Emaar, Dubai Mall and Dubai Hills Mall, Majid Al Futtaim Mall of the Emirates and Deira Murdiff City Centre to rethink their approach. The response? Hybrid models, combining physical stores with e-commerce platforms to stay relevant. The government took an active role in keeping the market stable. Policies like mandatory escrow accounts and developer pre-funding requirements were designed to prevent risky speculation. On the economic side, the government cut commercial fees from 5% to 2.5%, making it easier for businesses to operate. At the same time, major infrastructure projects were reshaping Dubai's future. The Dubai Waterfront Canal, Route 2020, metro expansion, and Maktoum International Airport Phase 2 were long-term investments for this city's growth. These developments ensured that even as the real estate market slowed, Dubai's global position remained strong. Between 2015 and 2019, Dubai's real estate market went through a necessary correction. Speculative booms faded, the focus shifted towards long-term stability. While oversupply and price declines created challenges, the city's investment in infrastructure, hospitality, and regulatory transparency helped maintain investor confidence. Expo 2020 was a turning point for Dubai's economy, driving large-scale infrastructure projects and accelerating long-term urban planning. The event brought in 25 million visitors, with 30% coming from within the UAE, which led to an increased focus on transport development, including the expansion of Dubai's Metro Red Line and discussions on underground railway connections at the Expo site. Developers moved quickly. Nakheel resumed stalled projects, and new districts like MBR City gained momentum. The retail and hospitality sectors saw a surge in consumer spending estimated at $10 billion, creating new opportunities for SMEs while also raising concerns about inflation and rising business costs. Aviation also expanded with billions invested in aircraft orders and airport infrastructure in DWC. The event itself may have been temporary, but its impact on trade, tourism, and real estate positioned Dubai for continued economic activity well beyond 2020. Dubai's real estate market has always been driven by international capital. By 2022, foreign nationals owned 43% of a residential real estate, a massive $122 billion market. The reasons are clear. Dubai's tax-free environment, golden visa incentives, and global instability pushing investors towards safer assets. Geopolitics played a major role. The Russia-Ukraine conflict redirected billions into Dubai, making it a safe haven for Russian capital. But not everything was smooth sailing. US interest rates hiked, making finance more expensive. And a strong US dollar increased property costs for investors from Europe and the UK. Yet, Dubai investor-friendly policies kept foreign demand steady. In 2022, over 1 million Russians visited Dubai, a 60% increase from the previous year. And while the data isn't 100% clear about the number of Russians that have moved here, the data on how much they have spent on real estate is about $6.2 billion since 2022. Dubai's currency pegged to the US dollar is both a blessing and a challenge. Higher US interest rates meant higher UAE mortgage rates, pricing some buyers out. A 1% increase in rate led to an estimated 17% drop in transactions. But here's the thing. Luxury investors don't rely on mortgages. While mid-market sales slowed, high-end properties in areas like Emirates Hills stayed resilient. Dubai has mastered the art of turning global events into real estate demand. Expo 2020 brought 24 million visitors and boosting rentals and investments in the Expo City and Emaar South, with prices trending at 2,000 dirhams per square feet approximately. GITEX, Gulf Foods, Arab Travel Market are a few of Dubai's capacity to hold large-scale exhibitions. And the real estate market near the World Trade Center like Zabil 1-2, which are trending at 2,500 to 3,000 dirhams per square feet. Rental yields have trended at 5 to 7% depending on the area for as long as we can remember. COP28 put a spotlight on green developments, increasing interest in eco-conscious projects like Expo City, which is a 100% sustainable city. Rental transactions were at an all-time high in 2024. However, with the incentives foreign buyers are getting, we can expect rental drops and home ownerships to increase. Currently, only 30% of Dubai residents are home owners. In China, 90% are home owners. In US and UK, 60% are home owners. China has had a large oversupply of properties in the market, so they have been providing incentives like lowered property tax on their second homes. The market has gone through 3 distinct phases. The pandemic shock, 2020-21, lockdowns, slow transactions, but villas and townhouses skyrocketed in demand as people sought more space. Average prices shortly dropped by 15 to 20% in 2020, but boosted 20 to 25% annually. Post-pandemic boom, 22 to 23, prices in Dubai Hills and Palm Jumeirah surged 30% year-on-year, fueled by global capital and changing lifestyle trends. Tighter monetary conditions, 23-24. Rising US interest rates hit mortgage-dependent buyers, but luxury sales remain strong. The likes of Emaar Beachfront, Barari, Arabian Ranches 1-2, Emirates Hills, Dubai Hills Estate, Jumeirah Golf Estate, Jumeirah Bay Island District 1, almost all appreciated at 100%. What do most of these communities have in common? They are villa and townhouses communities. During the pandemic, we know that work from home became largely adopted. People disliked being stuck in the 4 walls of their 1,200 square feet apartments, so villas and townhouses communities began to popularize post-pandemic. Dubai has faced economic cycles before, and its proactive approach ensures it stays competitive. Between 2010 and 12, apartment prices in Dubai declined from 78 dirhams per square feet to around 68 dirhams. while villa prices remained stable at 60 dirhams per square feet. This was followed by a sharp increase between 13 and 15, with apartments peaking above 105 dirhams and villa reaching at 80 dirhams in 2015, driven by economic expansions and high investment inflows. However, from 2016 to 20, the market experienced a prolonged downturn, with prices dropping below 70 for apartments and 55 for villas, likely due to oversupply and economic slowdowns. The post-COVID recovery from 21 to 24 was strong as apartment prices surged past 120 and villas exceeded 100, reflecting increased demand, economic diversification, and highlighted foreign investor interest. Okay, let's talk about rental yields in Dubai. Rental yields have been slowly and gradually and quietly dropping, about 0.5 to 0.8% per year. Nothing dramatic, but noticeable. Back in 2010, if you owned an apartment in Dubai, you were pulling in a solid 9.3% yield. Villas, around 6.3%. Apartments have always had higher yields due to factors like low entry prices, larger tenant pool, higher service charges, and prime locations near business hubs. Fast forward to today, yields have slipped. Apartments now sit at around 7.5%, villas are closer to 5%. What are we seeing here? Is Dubai edging toward what you'd call a matured market? In matured market, rental yields are low, really low. London, 2 to 3%, New York about the same. The reason? More people own their homes, and Dubai is starting to see the same trend. More end users, more HNIs, more ultra HNIs, buying to hold, not flip. This shift away from speculative investing means villas and townhouse communities, particularly in the luxury segment, are now more about long-term appreciation rather than short-term rental returns. If you're after high yields, you're looking at places like Business Bay, JVC, International City, and Sports City. But here's the catch. More supply is coming. More buildings, more competition, more landlords fighting over the same tenants. That means rental income will hold up, but capital appreciation going to slow down. Meanwhile, high demand, low supply areas will keep appreciating, but rental yields will compress. And here's the bigger picture. Dubai's real estate is still investor-friendly, no doubt about that. But some areas are already showing signs of yield compression, just like London and New York. If price growth continues at this pace, 3 to 4% yields in prime areas could be the new norm. Investors need to start thinking, are you in for the rental income or the capital appreciation? Because Dubai's market is evolving, and the strategy that worked 10 years ago might not work 10 years from now. Supply expected in 2025 is almost 3 times as much as 2024 at 86,000 units. Delays can be expected as they have done for the last so-and-so years. And 2026 will be absolute. Short-term rentals also collapsed due to travel restrictions and reduced expat movement. Tourism, a key driver of Dubai's economy, collapsed, adding pressure to hospitality-linked real estate assets. Dubai's economy isn't dependent on oil, but regional oil wealth still affects the real estate. When oil prices exceeded $100 per barrel in 2022, GCC sovereign wealth funds poured money into Dubai, helping the market grow. Increased tourism budgets funded by oil revenues helped Dubai record 14.4 million visitors in 2022, boosting hotel and short-term rental demand. Infrastructure projects like Etihad Rail benefited from oil-fueled government spending, driving property demand in areas along the new railway. But oil prices swings. When oil fell to $20 per barrel in 2020, GCC-based real estate investments in Dubai dropped by 13%. At one point, oil prices were in the negatives. This means that oil companies were paying people to take their oil. The takeaway? Oil prices impact the region, but Dubai has built an economy that can withstand this cycle. Dubai isn't slowing down. The 2040 Urban Master Plan is all about green spaces, smarter buildings, and better infrastructure to handle a growing population. New districts like Dubai South, MBR City aren't just real estate projects. They are a part of a bigger vision for a more connected, efficient city. And it's not just about where people live, it's how they move. By 2030, a quarter of Dubai's transport will be autonomous. The metro is expanding. Al Maktoum International Airport will be handling 200 million passengers, turning Dubai South into a logistics and a trade powerhouse. Residential supply in 2025 will be around 84,000, give or take, due to the delays. And in 26, we can expect a supply of 117,000 units. Still, this supply does not expect to meet demands, considering the 2040 Agenda population goals. In order to reach a population of 7.6 million, the annual inflow of people must be approximately 5%, which is about 190,000. In 2024, we saw an influx of 170,000 people. Therefore, Dubai seems to be on track. The economy changing again. The D33 economic agenda is set to double Dubai's economy by 2033, aiming for AED 25.6 trillion in trade and FDI. The goal? Make Dubai one of the top 3 global cities by attracting tech, finance, international business, while also growing healthcare, education, and tourism. The real estate market is shifting to expect more focus on sustainability, smart homes, and energy efficiency in areas like Dubai South, Arabian Ranches, growing to meet this demand. So to wrap this up, we can attribute Dubai's success to being run like a business, hence the metaphor Dubai Inc. But how did this come to be? Go back just 50 to 75 years and you're looking down at a small trading town with barely any infrastructure, no oil wealth, no clear vision for the future. There was no skyline, no highways, no master plan, just a creek and some boats and merchants making a living off trade and pearls. That was Dubai. Sheikh Rashid built his vision and created a name that will never be forgotten in the Gulf. In the 1970s, while other Gulf countries were sitting on oil wealth, Sheikh Rashid knew Dubai had to think differently. The city had limited oil reserves and wasn't about to let that define its future. So instead of waiting for wealth to run out, he used what little oil money Dubai had as capital to invest, to build, to create something bigger. That's when things started changing really fast. Between 1970 and 1990, Dubai went through the most critical period of growth in its history. This is when it transformed from a small Gulf town into a real economic force. Sheikh Rashid expanded the ports, built roads, turned the city into a regional trade hub. He dredged Dubai Creek, built Port Rashid, created Jebel Ali Port, the largest man-made harbor in the world. Then came the Dubai World Trade Center in the 1980s, the tallest building in the Middle East at that time. Imagine that. Dubai wasn't even a major player yet, and it was already setting records. And that was just the beginning. The 2000s, that's when Dubai went really crazy. Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid took over, and the pace of growth was something the world had never seen before. Burj Khalifa, announced in 2003, completed in 2010, the tallest building in the world, built in 6 years. The Palm Jumeirah, they literally built an island out of the ocean, selling 2,000 villas in 3 days. At one point, Dubai had 25% of the world cranes. And yet, though all of this, Dubai didn't fall into the oil trap. Unlike other economies that boomed and busted with oil prices, Dubai built itself to last. Today, oil makes up less than 1% of its GDP. Instead, its trade in tourism, finance, real estate drive this economy. This diversification is what makes Dubai stable, what keeps it moving forward no matter what's happening globally. It's why people keep coming. The population is always growing, demand for real estate is always there, and Dubai isn't going anywhere anytime soon. A strong economy attracts foreign capital, particularly in real estate. As investors see Dubai as a stable and high return market, high GDP growth, government diversification, and a tax-free investment environment attracts foreign capital. With 43% of its residential real estate owned by foreign nationals, Dubai's commitment of business-friendly policies, long-term visas, and world-class infrastructure projects make it a low-risk, high-reward market. The city's strategic location, pegged currency stability, and aggressive expansion plans under the D33 economic agenda further solidify its status as a global hub for real estate investment and wealth preservation. And for me, Dubai isn't just a city, it's home. My grandfather lived here, my father built his life here, and I raised our family here. I have seen this city grown with my own eyes. And if you're looking for a place that's stable, ambitious, and built for the future, there's nowhere else quite like this. Thank you for listening. Signing off, Rakhi from Experience Realty.